I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The work of building an empire is a vast undertaking requiring a lot of resources. Joseph Smith was in the business of empire building since day one of his church organizing. By and large, the Mormon people stood behind their divine leader in these empire undertakings. Joe was able to successfully drain many of his followers of everything they owned for the purpose of building Zion, the kingdom of God on earth. Theirs wasn't just a business undertaking, but the greatest mission any group of people had ever been commissioned to carry out in all of human history. The Mormons were literally building the kingdom of God for Christ to reign from a throne upon his second coming. Constructing this Mormon empire had many moving parts, and all of those moving parts required lubrication in the form of money. Many Nauvoo public works projects had been started without ever reaching completion to return on that initial investment. The Nauvoo Canal Project, the manufacturing district, the shipping port on the Mississippi River, and a dozen other projects all drained resources from the Mormons without ever giving anything back. But there were other projects which were moving along, but not quickly enough. One of the main projects was becoming an absolute black hole of Mormon resources. That was the Nauvoo House. The Nauvoo House Association was formed in early 1841 by way of revelation in order to create a place for boarding the Smith family and for entertaining powerful politicians and dignitaries when they would visit the city. The Nauvoo House was to be the premier 4-star hotel experience in all of Illinois and attract visitors and tourism from all across the nation to see what the industrious Mormon city looked like. The Nauvoo House would also be very helpful for people making a journey up or down the Mississippi, as Nauvoo happened to be a great place to spend the night and to trade goods carried by the various steamers plowing up and down the Mississippi River year-round. There was, however, a fatal flaw with the Nauvoo House. It was created as a publicly traded association without any capital investment to get it started. It was simply formed as part of the Nauvoo City Charter and designated with a value, and wealthy Mormons were expected to purchase stock in the Nauvoo House in order to fund the construction, all with the expectation that it would be completed and that they would become wealthy holding stock in a wealthy company in just a few years' time. If the Nauvoo House was the only project the 10,000 plus Nauvoo Mormons were working on, it may have worked out. But the problem is they had too few resources spread too thin over too many projects, meaning none of these projects were actually being completed. By early 1844, it was necessary to form a triage list of the most desperate projects. Would it be forming more market districts? Would it be finally building a manufacturing plant on the Mississippi to create goods and be able to ship them up and down the river, as was initially intended with the location of the city? Would it be the canal to divert the unlimited power of the Mississippi through the center of town and provide mechanical power to all of the hoped-for factories that were planned? No. It was the Nauvoo Temple. From a purely economical perspective, a temple is an interesting proposition. I mean, the church today recognizes that at the end of the day, temples are investments. Look, you build a temple and you require tithing income for locals near the temple to enter it. Once the temple is completed, hopefully a bunch of people renew their temple recommends, they catch up on their tithing, and they continue to pay tithing to be able to continue having access to the temple. The overhead for this investment is pretty low because there are no raw materials that are needed, and the work within the temple is volunteer. So temples really are, in many ways, a cash cow for the church. But the calculus which goes into constructing a temple today is a bit different than the calculus considered for the Nauvoo Temple. When the church today considers a location for a new temple, they look at the demographics of the prospective area. How many people live in the area who actively attend church weekly? What's the average household income of the neighborhood and the surrounding city? Is there a plot of land which can be cheaply acquired yet still looks desirable to have a temple sitting on? And a few other factors, right? But at the end of the day, the result is retrenchment of the members near the temple and increased tithing income. Maybe an occasional non-member goes to the visitor center and they pick up a pamphlet and they agree to have the missionary over, and then they get baptized, and hey, you have a new source of tithing income as well. But the calculus which served at the genesis of the Nauvoo Temple, it was similar, but different in many ways. Nauvoo was the headquarters of the Mormon population, so they weren't really going to shop around for other possible locations. There was really only one hill in Nauvoo, so the location was already decided for the leadership before they ever chose to break ground on the temple. But once again, the result at the end of the day was an appealing economic one. Construct one building, take in a ton of tithing income with very little overhead and absolutely no payroll expenses. Temples are a cash cow. What this means is the resolve of the leadership to prioritize the temple over the dozens of other projects still in progress. It was a very selfish choice. It benefited the leadership with greater tithing, but it absolutely did nothing to improve the overall financial situation of the average Mormons living in Nauvoo. With the temple done, understandably, there was hope for expanded economic possibilities. Once the temple was completed, it would be a shining example to the outside world of the Mormons' industriousness. Of course, they must be a good religion. Look at how beautiful that huge white building is up on the temple. I better join the Mormons and give them my tithing money too. There were, however, disagreements about which project should be prioritized as they were making this triage list. Joe wanted the Nauvoo house done so he could make friends with more powerful dignitaries, of course, while the Quorum of Apostles thought that prioritizing the temple was the best economic and religious option. From Robert Bruce Flanders, Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, beginning on page 189, quote, "At the annual conference in April 1843, Smith complained that, quote, there is no place in this city where men of wealth, character, and influence from abroad can go and repose themselves, and it is necessary we should have such a place. This is the most important matter for the time being. The church must build it, the Nauvoo house, or abide the result of not obeying the commandment." Back to Flanders. On April 24th, 1843, Smith told the 12 to wake up the people to the importance of building the Nauvoo house, as there was prejudice against it in favor of the temple. The prospects of the Nauvoo house were waning, however, despite the considerable energy which Smith exerted in its behalf. Its conception was too grand for the available resources. Finally, work languished and then stopped altogether. In the summer of 1843, even the prophet lost faith to the extent that he built a wing on his house, the Nauvoo Mansion, and opened it as a hotel. In February 1844, Miller and White were asking to leave the project to go to Texas. And on March 7th, Brigham Young, never as much interested in the hotel as he was in the temple, urged the completion of the one and the abandonment of the other. In a sermon, he said, now quoting Brigham Young, "I expect that the saints are so anxious to work on the temple and so ready to do right that God has whispered to the prophet, build the temple and let the Nauvoo house alone at the present." End quote. So the Quorum of Apostles, likely at the behest of Brigham Young, who was the pencil pusher, the good accountant, the business guy, they had pushed Joe towards sending more resources the way of the temple instead of the Nauvoo house. Joe renewed his public calls for reinvigoration about the temple project by selling it as the absolute greatest aspiration the city could attain. From page 191 of Flanders' book, quote, "Smith made it clear that the Nauvoo Temple was to be no ordinary meeting house, but was to play an integral and indispensable role in new religious modes which were to come." Now quoting Joseph, "The temple of the Lord is in process of erection here," he wrote, "where the saints will come to worship according to the order of his house and the powers of the holy priesthood, and will be so constructed as to enable all the functions of the priesthood to be duly exercised, and where instructions from the Most High will be received and will go forth to distant lands." End quote. What cannot be ignored here is the religious significance of the temple as a place of worship. As Flanders said, this wasn't a church, this was a temple. And this is a temple where initiates were devoted to keep the deepest and darkest secrets of what transpired therein. There's something that happens to the mind of a person when they walk into a large structure like a temple that's devoted solely to spiritual pursuits. Walk into a Mormon chapel and see how you feel, and then walk into the Dome Cathedral in Cologne or the Sistine Chapel, right? The feeling you get when entering each of these buildings is far different than just any old church. The grandiose size, the awe-inducing workmanship and details which go into these temple and these massive cathedral buildings, it has a subconscious effect on the attendee, and it strikes wonder in the mind of the curious or of the believer, while simultaneously striking fear into the hearts of the enemies of the faith. Those subconscious effects are harnessed by the people building the temple and preaching within its chambers. But with Mormon theology, temples and the purpose of them runs much deeper. And what do I mean by that? Well, secrecy. Mormons will often say what goes on in the temple is sacred, not secret, but that's just a dodge to make it not seem like a cult. The temple rituals are inherently secret, and until 1990 included swearing oaths of self-mutilation or consent to being murdered for revealing the secrets of those ceremonies. Initiates literally motion slitting their own throats and disemboweling themselves should they apostatize and reveal what happens inside that hallowed chamber. Think of the ways that the mindset these practices create can be abused. The highest ranks of Mormon leadership in Nauvoo were doing all sorts of seedy things, from illegal adultery, polygamy, to sowing seeds of treason against the United States by forming plans to commit a violent coup against the powers that be. The secrecy of those meetings was kept relatively tight-lipped when they were held in the upper floor of the Red Brick Store or in the Masonic Meeting House, but if those meetings were to transpire in a completed House of the Lord, with all of those subconscious effects at play that put an air of religious supremacy over anything that happens during the meetings, it's much more likely that the information that is transferred during those meetings never gets leaked, and more people in larger congregations can be trusted with the deepest secrets of the kingdom. For Joseph Smith and his religio-political practices, the temple was exactly the tool he needed to ensure secrecy to his ever-expanding ranks of closest devotees. To reiterate, secrecy is one of the primary purposes of a Mormon temple, and Joe wanted the Nauvoo Temple created and finished and completed and dedicated so that he could run his criminal empire with impunity. In accordance with this mindset, by January and February of 1844, Joe's renewed devotion to completing the temple project became a centerpiece of his public sermons. He'd introduced the practices of baptisms for the dead back in 1840 when his own father died, and the Mormons loved the idea of baptisms for the dead because their non-believing family members could now be baptized posthumously and then receive their exaltation. But after hundreds of Mormons got dunked in the Mississippi that summer and autumn for thousands of dead relatives, Joe realized he could commodify dead people's salvation by telling the Mormons that they would no longer be able to baptize for the dead until the ordinances could be completed in the Nauvoo Temple. This became his bargaining chip to motivate the people to renew their efforts on completing the temple. So on a cold, rainy Sunday morning, the 20th of January, 1844, Joe stood in front of a large congregation of quote-unquote several thousand people in quote-unquote somewhat unpleasant weather to reiterate just how important the temple project was. This is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 6, page 207. Quote, "When I consider the surrounding circumstances in which I am placed to this day, standing in the open air with weak lungs and somewhat out of health, I feel that I must have the prayers and faith of my brethren that God may strengthen me and pour out his special blessings upon me if you get much from me this day. There are many people assembled here today and throughout this city and from various parts of the world who say that they have received to a certainty a portion of knowledge from God by revelation in the way that he has ordained and pointed out. I shall take the broad ground then, that if we have or can receive a portion of knowledge from God by immediate revelation, by the same source we can receive all knowledge. What shall I talk about today? I know what Brother Cahoon wants me to speak about. He wants me to speak about the coming of Elijah in the last days. I can see it in his eye. I will speak on that subject then. The Bible says, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Now the word turn here should be translated bind or seal. That's very magical. That has traditions deep within the roots of magic and Christian occult traditions. But what is the object of this important mission, or how is it to be fulfilled? The keys are to be delivered. The spirit of Elijah is to come. Yeah, which kind of flies in the face of the idea that Elijah came in the Kirtland Temple and sealed the keys on Joseph Smith at that time. Now he's saying the spirit of Elijah is to come. The gospel to be established, the saints of God gathered, Zion built up, and the saints to come up as saviors on Mount Zion. But how are they to become saviors on Mount Zion? By building their temples, erecting their baptismal fonts, and going forth and receiving all the ordinances, baptisms, confirmations, washings, anointings, ordinations, and sealing powers upon their heads in behalf of all their progenitors who are dead. Once again, commodifying baptisms for the dead. And redeem them, that they may come forth in the first resurrection to be exalted to thrones of glory with them. And herein is the chain that binds the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, which fulfills the mission of Elijah. And I would to God that this temple was now done, that we might go into it and go to work and improve our time and make use of the seals while they are on earth. Once again, he is commodifying all of these very deep Mormon theological practices and ordinances and ceremonies to relegating them to when the temple itself is complete. You guys complete the temple, then we can build the kingdom of God. As long as you guys haven't done it, then we have not aspired to full exaltation. He continues. The saints have not too much time to save and redeem their dead and gather together their living relatives, that they may be saved also before the earth will be smitten and the consumption decreed falls upon the world. The world's coming to an end. Let's finish this temple, everybody. I would advise all saints to go with their might and gather together all their living relatives to this place, that they may be sealed and saved, that they may be prepared against the day that the destroying angel comes forth. And if the whole church should go to with all their might to save their dead, seal their posterity, and gather their living friends, and spend none of their time in behalf of the world, they would hardly get through before the night would come, when no man can work. And my only trouble at the present time is concerning ourselves, that the saints will be divided, broken up, and scattered before we get our salvation secure. For there are so many fools in the world for the devil to operate upon. It gives him the advantage oftentimes. The question is frequently asked, can we not be saved without going through all these ordinances, etc.? I would answer, no, not the fullness of salvation. Jesus said, there are many mansions in my Father's house, and I will go and prepare a place for you. House here named should have been translated kingdom, and any person who is exalted to the highest mansion has to abide a celestial law, and the whole law too. Once again, the celestial law can only come once the temple is complete. He continues, just a couple paragraphs left. But there has been a great difficulty in getting anything into the heads of this generation. It has been like splitting hemlock knots with a corn dodger for a wedge and a pumpkin for a beetle. Even the saints are slow to understand. I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. Like monogamy, contrary to their traditions. They cannot stand the fire at all. How many will be able to abide a celestial law and go through and receive their exaltation? I am unable to say. As many are called, but few are chosen. End quote. See, this was a call to bring more Mormons to Nauvoo or to the surrounding cities to give until it hurts and get back to work and finish the temple. And to be clear, the system of tithing for the destitute Mormons at this point was donating time. 1 in every 10 days was to be given by every able-bodied man for manual labor on the temple, because so few of the Mormons had any money that they could give to the project. And really, in many ways, desperation for money has been an underlying tension for every bit of Nauvoo Mormon history. Well, Missouri Mormon history as well. And Kirtland Mormon history and New York Mormon history. Okay, desperation for money was an underlying tension even for the Smith family before the Book of Mormon was published, now that I think about it. But that desperation for money was at a fever pitch in early 1844. Not only was the city itself unable to meet the demands of unfinished public works projects, but Joseph Smith himself was falling dangerously far behind on all his own financial commitments. Not only was he unable to pay all of the land speculation contracts that he had signed to settle Nauvoo in the half-breed tract in Iowa, he couldn't even make the interest payments on those loans. His red brick store was a fitting name because it was constantly running in the red. As trustee in the trust of the church, he had too much property listed at too high a price for it to sell without a directive from the Almighty. Even Thomas Sharp, in his Warsaw Message, commented on Joe's land speculation in the 17th of January 1844 edition. Quote, "It may not be generally known that the Mormon prophet is a great land speculator. The following is a standing advertisement in the Nauvoo Neighbor. Will show how he operates upon the brethren in that line." Now, this is reprinting a standing advertisement that is published in every edition of the Nauvoo Neighbor. Quote, "Notice to immigrants and Latter-day Saints generally. I feel it my duty to say to the brethren generally, and especially those who are emigrating to this place, that there is in the hands of the trustee and trust a large quantity of lands, both in the city and adjoining townships in this county, which is for sale, some of which belongs to the church and is designed for the benefit of the poor, and also to liquidate debts owing by the church, for which the trustee and trust is responsible." Joe said it. He said it out loud. He said, "I'm in too much debt. Come buy my property." The flyer continues. "Some also is land which has been consecrated for the building of the temple, and some for the Nauvoo house. If the brethren who move in here and want an inheritance will buy their lands from the trustee and trust, they will thereby benefit the poor, the temple, and the Nauvoo house, and even then only be doing that which is their duty, and which I know by considerable experience will be vastly for their benefit and satisfaction in the days to come." End quote. So, to summarize, notice to everybody, we have a ton of land that we need to sell really fast to pay off debts. If you buy it, it'll be a great service to all of the poorest of the Mormons, and it will be to your benefit in the days to come. You know, when the world ends, it's going to be real nice to have a select plot in downtown Nauvoo, apparently. But it wasn't just unsold land. Signs were all over that the Mormon pocketbook was feeling a little bit light in, Joe's breast pocket. Joe relied on an old friend who converted in the Kirtland era with significant personal wealth, Ebenezer Robinson. Joe decided a quick way to alleviate some of his own personal debts would be to sell the Nauvoo mansion, his own house, and the red brick store to Ebenezer Robinson, while the printing press establishment housing the Times and Seasons and the Nauvoo Neighbor will officially be transferred to another relatively wealthy Mormon, John Taylor, the second prophet of the Brighamite tradition. Once again, from the History of the Church, Volume 6, page 208, quote, "Monday, January 22nd, William Clay Knapp, President Joseph's commenced taking inventory of goods, groceries, etc. for Joseph and settling with Ebenezer Robinson." The goods, groceries, etc. Just for the red brick store that Joseph was selling to Ebenezer Robinson. Continuing on. "Rainy, wind easterly, mud very deep. Rented the Nauvoo mansion and stables to Ebenezer Robinson for $1,000 per annum, and board for myself and family and horses, reserving to myself 3 rooms in the house." So Joe sold the Nauvoo mansion to Ebenezer Robinson and then rented from him 3 rooms of the house for his family and, for his horses and stuff. Then Tuesday, the 23rd of January, Ebenezer Robinson took possession of the Nauvoo mansion to continue it as a public house. William Mines Phelps, Newell K. Whitney, and Willard Richards valued the printing office and lot at $1,500. Printing apparatus, $950. Bindery, $112. Foundry, $270. Total, $2,382. I, having sold the concern to John Taylor, who, in consideration, was to assume the responsibility of the Lawrence estate, end quote. So, and we've talked about the Lawrence estate very briefly, but essentially those were the rich orphans that Joseph and Emma took into their home, and they took possession. They acted as wards for the estate that these 2 young girls had. And it was a massive deal that Joseph Smith dealt with, that he essentially stole that money from these two orphans. So somehow the Lawrence estate was involved in selling the printing office and all of the printing apparatus and everything to John Taylor. So, I mean, the thing is, like, these passages, they're pretty simple. They're pretty easy to overlook. But what they reveal is that Joe had a lot of debt that was crushing him. I mean, he had filed for bankruptcy back in 1842, and he was denied bankrupt status because his affairs were too deeply intertwined with church assets. So there was no escape from the creditors, who were more and more insistent on him with every passing day. You see, in many ways, Joe was a paper millionaire with all of his assets, but his liabilities so far outweighed his assets by possibly as much as 2 or 3 times, a disparity which was only growing with every passing month's interest piling on top. Joe lived lavishly, but it was all fake. Everything he had was built on credit, and almost all of it was years overdue. He was taking out loans to pay off other loans. He was building hotels and selling them off with his name on them in order to make some kind of money. I mean, he probably ran casinos, and he certainly oversaw the affairs at the Nauvoo brothels, and all of his best friends were as insanely corrupt as humanly possible. In many ways, he's the perfect candidate to be president of the United States, isn't he? But it wasn't just Joe himself who was coming under increased pressure and looking for an out. The average Mormon was having a rough go of it too, as the Nauvoo Temple continued to suck the oxygen for community growth out of the Mormon society chamber. The Quorum of Apostles drafted a letter to a longtime font of community support for the church, the Isaac Morley family. Little background, the Morley family were some of the earliest members in Kirtland, Ohio in the first year of the church. It was the first experiment in Mormon communalism, as per the Book of Mormon, but only worked because the Morley family, the Morley farm, they were practicing communalism with Hingepin Sidney Rigdon as their pastor for years before the Book of Mormon was a thing. Well, Isaac Morley was the leader of the Mormon commune in Kirtland, but then he dug up roots to move to Missouri as one of the early Mormon settlements there. The Morley commune continued their practices for half a decade in Missouri until the Missouri Mormon War chased all the Mormons out of the state. When Isaac Morley and his fellow communalists moved to Quincy during the Exodus of 1839, they settled in a small town between Quincy and Nauvoo, which they called Yellrum. It's Morley backwards. Yellrum is Morley backwards. So clever. Just like, the Council of 50 being called the Council of Yitfif. You gotta love the nicknames. Mormons have always been super creative with their nicknames, right? Namo family? All my Namo family who's listening to this podcast. Anyway, so the Yellrum settlement, Morley Yellrum, was about 30 miles directly south of Nauvoo, with Carthage and Warsaw, the two anti-Mormon hotbeds, lying in between Yellrum and Nauvoo. So with all of the violence brewing between Carthage and Nauvoo that we discussed last week, the members of the church living in Yellrum were beginning to feel isolated, being geographically cut off from Nauvoo, which will be a major issue in 1845 when the Illinois militia chose to march on the city of Yellrum and burn it to the ground. So, instead of providing solace and support from headquarters, this letter sent by the Quorum of Apostles to the Yellrum settlement calls on the Morley family to send provisions to Nauvoo to aid in the temple construction. Instead of saying, hey, the Nauvoo Legion has your back if the anti-Mormons march on you. No, this is the content of the letter. Quote, "Beloved brethren, while the work of the Lord is great and sought out by all them that have pleasure therein, the Lord of the vineyard has laid special charges upon some of his servants to execute. And while we are striving by all means to raise funds to hasten the temple, the approaching spring, we are not unmindful of the history of the church, the great proclamation to the kings of the earth, and the memorials to Congress, etc., all of which are now before the church through their progress, though their progress is retarded for the want of the necessities of life in the families of those who are employed in this business. we again call on you, as those who have ever been ready to listen to the wants of the church, that you would raise such collections of provisions as you may have at your disposal, and forward the same without delay, that is emphasized in italics, to us for the special benefit of the clerks of President Smith or the church. Asking no more, it is right they should not go hungry or naked. Do you ask what is wanting? We answer, look to your own households and say what it requires to make them comfortable, and you will know just what is wanting by these men. Eatables of every kind, and even soap to keep their hands clean is scarce at Nauvoo, and it takes many lights to keep the pen in motion these long evenings. We are confident that when you are made acquainted with the facts, you will be unwilling that Joseph should do all and get all the blessings. And as you shall continue your liberality in temporal things, God shall pour out upon your heads blessings, spiritual and temporal, and now is the time for action." End quote. You see, Joseph Smith shouldn't be the only one getting all of the blessings for all of his tireless work to help build up the church. He wants to spread the blessings around by spreading the work around. So just give him some of your stuff. You don't need everything that you have right now to live, right? Just send it to Joseph. What a guy Joseph is. I mean, we may laugh at this letter from our lens, from our perspective. But remember, this extortion is exactly how every single Mormon ward works today, without hiring anybody to run the buildings or to balance the books or to deal with the kids in the nursery or to preach to the congregation, right? This is the same mentality that the church operates with today. My point is, everything in January of 1844 reeks of desperation. Add into this a letter that Joe sent to the Green Mountain Boys. The Green Mountain Boys were a private militia that formed in the 1760s in what would become the Vermont Republic. They were led by Ethan Allen during the Revolutionary War when they captured Fort Ticonderoga in May of 1775. Now, the Green Mountain Boys had officially disbanded, but they were mustered again for the War of 1812 and a bunch of other little scuffles. But they became a recognized militia of Vermont, and the Vermont National Guard still, to this day, uses the Green Mountain Boys flag. Well, Joe wanted the Green Mountain Boys to join forces with the Nauvoo Legion in order to snuff out anti-Mormon violence in cities near Nauvoo. But to a deeper degree, what Joe really wanted from the Green Mountain Boys was their support to make Missouri pay for what Joe saw as the injustices of the Missouri Mormon War and the fallout of the Mormon Exodus. Now remember, throughout all of this, Joe was dead to rights in Missouri. Okay, the state government had him on arson, robbery, high treason, and murder. So Joe couldn't step foot in the state of Missouri without his own militia surrounding him, or he'd be arrested and immediately hung. But Joe was known to hold a personal animus toward Missouri for the remainder of his life, while the state authorities from Illinois and Missouri repeatedly tried to arrest and extradite him to Missouri to answer for his crimes. Well, he thought that if he could just burn the whole state to the ground, he wouldn't have to deal with the whole Missouri problem anymore. And in many ways, he would get revenge for what he perceived as theft of his property and the property of all of the Mormons when the Mormons were driven out of the state and forced to settle as refugees in Illinois. But the problem was, the Nauvoo Legion wasn't big enough yet to wage a war against Missouri without sustaining heavy casualties. So Joe thought if the Green Mountain Boys agreed to join forces to raise the state, he'd lose a lot less of his own Nauvoo militia, right? His Nauvoo Legion militia. And the thing is this mentality, joining forces with another militia to force a coup on the Missouri government, this isn't presidential, as other things that we've discussed in the episode so far. This is tyrannical. Now, a few excerpts from his letter to the Green Mountain Boys. We're going to read through them here. He begins by appealing to the Vermont militia by telling them that, hey, you know what? I'm a Vermonter myself. You're going to find a link to this entire letter in the show notes. We're not going to read through the whole thing, just select portions of it, but it is quite interesting and revealing. So let's go ahead and get started. Quote, Like other honest citizens, I not only, when manhood came, sought my own peace, prosperity, and happiness, but also the peace, prosperity, and happiness of my friends. And with all the rights and realm before me and the revelations of Jesus Christ to guide me in all truth, I had good reasons to enter into the blessings and privileges of an American citizen, the rights of a Green Mountain boy, unmolested, and enjoy life and religion according to the most virtuous and enlightened customs, rules, and etiquette of the 19th century. But to the disgrace of the United States, it is not so. These rights and privileges, together with a large amount of property, have been wrested from me and thousands of my friends by a lawless mob in Missouri, supported by executive authority, and the crime of plundering our property and the unconstitutional and barbarous act of our expulsion, and even the inhumanity of murdering men, women, and children, have received the password of justifiable by legislative enactments, and the horrid deeds, doleful and disgraceful as they are, have been paid for by government. In vain we have sought for redress of grievances and a restoration to our rights in the courts and legislature of Missouri. In vain we have sought for our rights and the remuneration for our property in the halls of Congress and at the hands of the President. The only consolation yet experienced from these highest tribunals and mercy seats of our bleeding country is that our cause is just, but the government has no power to redress us." End quote. Now, okay, so never forget this. Joe was banking on a payout from the federal government in order to pay all of his land speculation debts. Through 1839, he and the Quorum of Apostles, after he had escaped Liberty Jail, he and the Quorum of Apostles collected affidavits from the Mormons in Quincy and Commerce about the recent Missouri Mormon War, and their exodus, or their forced exodus from Missouri to Illinois, in order to petition the U.S. government for redress. Their request was for $1.2 million. It was denied not only by Congress, but by President Van Buren himself. Now, there are legitimate grievances for what the Mormons went through, but also don't forget that Joe is painting the Mormons as helpless martyrs of the outrages committed by a horrible and depraved set of lawless anti-Mormons, and he's doing so by downplaying any Mormon aggression during the conflict. In this letter, Joseph Smith is far more dishonest about the Mormons' role in the war than even Parley Pratt was when he wrote his propaganda rag History of the Late Persecution Inflicted by the State of Missouri upon the Mormons when he published it in 1839. He wrote that from his jail cell when he was currently in jail because he was arrested as a result of the Missouri Mormon War. And of course, sign up on patreon.com/nakedmormonism to gain access to that entire audiobook with my commentary along with it. You can just put it in the search bar. History of the Late Persecution Inflicted by the State of Missouri upon the Mormons in 1839. It's a propaganda rag, but Parley Pratt was more honest than the prophet of the God in this letter to the Green Mountain Boys. So Joe continues his appeal to this private militia. Quote, "Our arms were forcibly taken from us by those Missouri marauders, and in spite of every effort to have them returned, the state of Missouri still retains them. And the United States militia law, with this fact before the government, still compels us to military duty, and for a lack of said arms, the law forces us to pay fines. As Shakespeare would say, thereby hangs a tale. Several $100,000 worth of land in Missouri was purchased at the U.S. land offices in that district of country, and the money, without doubt, has been appropriated to strengthen the Army and Navy or increase the power and glory of the nation in some other way. And notwithstanding, Missouri has robbed and mobbed me and 12 or 15,000 innocent inhabitants, murdered and hundreds expelled, the residue at the point of a bayonet without law, contrary to the express language of the Constitution of the United States and every state of the Union. and contrary to the custom and usage of civilized nations, and especially one upholding the motto, the asylum of the oppressed. Yet the comfort we receive to raise our wounded bodies and invigorate our troubled spirits on account of such immense sacrifices of life, property, patience, and right, and as an equivalent for the enormous taxes we are compelled to pay to support the functionaries in a dignified manner, after we have petitioned and pleaded with tears and been shown like a caravan of foreign animals for the peculiar gratification of connoisseurs in humanity. I'm going to summarize this in a second, just bear with me. That flare along in public life like lamps upon lampposts because they are better calculated for the schemes of the night than for the scenes of the day is, as President Van Buren said, your cause is just, but the government has no power to redress you. The Mormons have suffered a lot. I'm summarizing. The Mormons have suffered a lot. And all that we get in answer for this is President Van Buren saying, your cause is just, but the government has no power to redress you. We'll dig into that in a second. Joe continues. No wonder, after the Pharisees' prayer, the publican smote his breast and said, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. What must the manacled nations think of freemen's rights in the land of liberty? End quote. And okay, God, this is such an arduous read to get through, and I cut out the most horrible and ranty and nonsensical portions, I promise you. But after this, Joe digresses into Chaldean, into Egyptian, into Indian, Italian, Samaritan, Syrian, German, and half dozen other languages of just absolute distress. It's like he's saying, see, I'm a polymath just like you guys. And I have to admit, I assume that almost none of his quote unquote translations of all of these languages are actually accurate. But he finally gets to the point. Quote, I am compelled to appeal to the honor and patriotism of my native state, to the clemency and valor of the Green Mountain Boys, for throughout the various periods of the world, whenever a nation, kingdom, state, family, or individual has received an insult or an injury from a superior force, it has been made the custom to call in the aid of friends to assist in obtaining redress. With all these facts before me and a pure desire to ameliorate the condition of the poor and unfortunate among men, and, if possible, to entice all men from evil to good, and with a firm reliance that God will reward the just, I have been stimulated to call upon my native state for a union of all honest man, and appeal to the valor of the Green Mountain Boys by all honorable methods and means to assist me in obtaining justice from Missouri, not only for the property she has stolen and confiscated, the murder she has committed among my friends, and for our expulsion from the state, but also to humble and chastise or abase her for the disgrace she has brought upon the constitutional liberty until she atones for her sins. End quote. Joe finally got to the point, and what he is basically saying is this is a declaration of war by Joseph Smith, who is a general of his own militia, calling upon another progressive New England militia to join forces and force Missouri to, quote unquote, atone for her sins, to teach her humility. This would be like Russell Nelson today calling on the California National Guard to help him invade Colorado and take land east of the Rockies by military force. I mean, this is insane. This is a military tyrant jealously calling on another militia to bolster the forces of his own, to call on reinforcements, to commit a campaign and burn the state of Missouri to the ground. And the thing is, like, people today will try to minimize the role of the Nauvoo Legion under Joe's leadership by saying that he never actually took them into active combat. Oh, Joseph Smith, he wasn't serious about running for president. He just did it for good press and as a symbolic protest. No, that mentality completely misses Joe's real intention. You see, had Joe got what he wanted, had the Green Mountain Boys responded to his cry in this letter, the Nauvoo Legion, together with the Green Mountain Boys, could have successfully waged war against Missouri and there would have been a second Missouri Mormon War in American history with hundreds or thousands of casualties. Don't ever let Joe's actions here, especially with this letter to the Green Mountain Boys, be minimized. He was a tyrant through and through, and he would stop at nothing, and he was motivated by animus towards the state of Missouri. He continues, I appeal also to the fraternity of brethren who are bound by kindred ties to assist a brother in distress. A brother in distress, a fraternity of brothers. In all cases where it can be done according to the rules of order, the rules of the order, to extend the boon of benevolence and protection in avenging the Lord of his enemies, as if a Solomon, a Hiram, a St. John, or a Washington raised his hands before a wondering world and exclaimed, my life for his, light, liberty, and virtue forever. End quote. This is a purely Masonic cry for help through print from one Master Mason to another Masonic organization, right? Masonry is based around Solomon's Temple with the passion narrative of Hiram Abiff's death, two names that were invoked here, celebrating St. John's Day, as the Mormons did every year, which is another Masonic thing, and alluding to the first president of the United States, who was a Freemason. So Joe, this question pervades Mormon history circles. Did Joe give the Masonic cry for help during the Carthage shootout? Well, he's certainly giving the Masonic cry for help in print from his Masonic organization, the Mormons, to another Masonic society to help him wage war against Missouri. That is what we just read. He continues, I bring this appeal before my native state for the solemn reason that an injury has been done and crimes have been committed, which a sovereign state of the federal compact, one of the great family of e pluribus unum, refuses to compensate by consent of parties, rules of law, customs of nations, or in any other way. I bring it also because the national government has fallen short of affording the necessary relief as before stated for want of power, leaving a large body of her own free citizens whose wealth went freely into her treasury for lands, and whose gold and silver for taxes still fills the pockets of her dignitaries, in ermine and lace, defrauded, robbed, moved, plundered, ravished, driven, exiled, and banished from the independent Republic of Missouri. End quote. Okay, so hang on. To clarify that point a little bit, the Mormons hadn't paid for their lands in Missouri. Look, very few of them had actually paid any physical specie, any actual coinage for the land that they settled in Jackson County, Missouri, because they were using the government program to settle newly stolen native lands that was west of the Mississippi, right? The government stole property land from the Native Americans. Well, they pushed the Native Americans out. They drove them out. They exterminated Native Americans west of the Mississippi, and people could move to a land. They could settle and plant crops, and then they could pay the government on a deferred 2-year timeline for the land that they settled. The Mormons hadn't actually paid the government for their land when they first were removed from Jackson County in 1833. And then during the 1838 conflict, some of the land had been paid for, but the vast majority of the Mormon settlements were on borrowed land that they'd merely signed contracts for. Had they been allowed to remain in Caldwell and Daviess County for a few more years after 1838, they may have made some significant payments to the government. But as it stood, they had just settled the land. They had just put down a white picket fence and planted some crops. Then, when they were removed from Missouri, they made claims that all that property had been stolen from them, along with all of the money that they paid the government. But the amount of land that they had actually paid for was very minuscule in comparison to the amount of land that they actually lived on. I mean, sure, they had built the homes themselves and they had planted the crops. So the land they were living on, it felt like it was their land. But what really matters to the government and to the state is what they actually hold contracts for. So when the Mormons compiled their folder of grievances to hand to the federal government, it was really hard to verify what they tallied up to make that $1.2 million because the state records for land they had actually paid for didn't actually corroborate the numbers that they claimed that they had paid. Also remember that $400,000 of that $1.2 million, that was just boldly asserted by Joseph and Hiram Smith with absolutely no documentation to base it on. My overall point is, like, Missouri, quote unquote, stealing the Mormons' property is a lot more complicated than Joe is making the case to the Green Mountain Boys for, because he is doing so to paint a picture that the Mormons were so terribly persecuted, which required never acknowledging any wrongdoing on his or the Mormons' part, or acknowledging that most of the land that they had been driven from, they actually hadn't paid for. He continues, "And in the appeal, let me say, raise your towers, pile your monuments to the sky, build your steam frigates, spread yourselves far and wide, and open the iron eyes of your bulwarks by sea and land. And let the towering church steeples marshal the county like the dreadful splendor of an army with bayonets. But remember the destruction of Pharaoh and his hosts. Remember the handwriting upon the wall. Mene, mene, teki aparsin. I don't know what that means. Remember the angel's visit to Sennacherib and the 185,000 Assyrians. Remember the end of the Jews in Jerusalem. And remember the Lord Almighty will avenge the blood of his saints that now crimsons the skirts of Missouri. Shall wisdom cry aloud and her speech not be heard? Has the majesty of American liberty sunk into such vile servitude and oppression that justice has fled? Have the glory and influence of a Washington, an Adams, a Jefferson, a Lafayette, and a host of others forever departed? And the wrath of a Cain, a Judas, and a Nero whirl forth in the heraldry of hell to sprinkle our garments with blood and lighten the darkness of midnight with the blaze of our dwellings? Where is the patriotism of 76? Where is the virtue of our forefathers? And where is the sacred honor of free men? Must we, because we believe in the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the administration of angels, and the communion of the Holy Ghost like the prophets and apostles of old, must we be mobbed with impunity? Be exiled from our habitations and property without remedy, murdered without mercy, and government find the weapons and pay the vagabonds for doing the jobs and give them the plunder into the bargain? Must we, because we believe in enjoying the constitutional privilege and right of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and because we believe in repentance and baptism for the remission of sins and the gift of the Holy Ghost by laying on of hands and the resurrection of the dead and the millennium and the day of judgment and the Book of Mormon is the history of the aborigines of the continent, must we be expelled from the institutions of our country, the rights of citizenship, and the graves of our friends and brethren in the government, lock the gate of humanity and shut the door of redress against us? If so, farewell, freedom. Adieu to personal safety, and let the red-hot wrath of offended God purify the nation of such sinks of corruption. For that realm is hurrying to ruin where vice has the power to expel virtue. My father, who stood several times in the battles of the American Revolution. What, when he was 5 years old, Joe? Joseph Smith Sr. was 5 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Anyway, my father, who has stood several times in the battles of the American Revolution, till his companions in arms had been shot dead at his feet, was forced from his home in far west Missouri by those civilized or Satanized savages in the dreary season of winter to seek shelter in another state, and the vicissitudes and sufferings consequent to his flight brought his honored gray head to the grave a few months after. And my youngest brother, also in the vigor and bloom of his youth, from his great exposure and fatigue in endeavoring to assist his parents on their journey, I and my brother Hiram being in chains in dungeons where they tried to feed us on human flesh in Missouri, was likewise so debilitated that he found a premature grave shortly after my father, and my mother, too, though she yet lingers among us, from her extreme exposure in that dreadful tragedy, was filled with rheumatic affections and other diseases which leave her no enjoyment of health. She is sinking in grief and pain, broken-hearted from Missouri persecution. Okay, let's pause there. Okay, this is a massive list of falsehoods and obfuscations. Joseph Sr., Big Daddy Cheese, never served in the American Revolution, and he died almost 2 years after the Exodus, not quote unquote a few months after. Okay, I mean, sure, Big Daddy Cheese's health was decreased by the winter Exodus, but it wasn't a direct result. And then Don Carlos Smith died because he was working in a dark and mildew-filled basement churning out propaganda as editor of the Times and Seasons, not because of anything that he'd suffered during the Exodus to Illinois. Either that or he was poisoned for opposing polygamy and Joe married his wife a few months later. The record, of course, isn't really clear. And Lucy Mack, she was feeble at this time, but that wasn't because of the Mormon Exodus. It was because she was almost 60 years old, living in the 1840s. Of course she was feeble. Also, the thing is, there's absolutely no evidence that the Liberty jailers tried to feed Joe and the 5 other men human flesh. That is just a baseless assertion made after the fact by Joseph himself, which pervades the story being told to this day. But the whole point of this letter to the Green Mountain Boys from Joseph Smith, the general of his militia, to another independent militia was to weave a persecution narrative. And we can't let pesky facts get in the way or that would ruin this whole thing, right? Of course, he continues. We should give him the Oscar for this. "O death, wilt thou not give to every honest man a heated dart to sting those wretches while they pollute the land?" Those wretches being the Missourians. "And, O grave, wilt thou not open the trap door to the pit of ungodly men that they may stumble in? I appeal to the Green Mountain Boys of my native state to rise in the majesty of virtuous freemen, and by all honorable means help bring Missouri to the bar of justice. If there is one whisper from the spirit of an Ethan Allen or a gleam from the shade of a General Stark, let it mingle with our sense of honor and fire our bosoms for the cause of suffering innocence, for the reputation of our disgraced country, and for the glory of God. And may all the earth bear me witness if Missouri, blood-stained Missouri, escapes the due merit of her crimes, the vengeance she so justly deserves, that Vermont is a hypocrite, a coward, and this nation the hotbed of political demagogues." That's Joe saying, help me or you're a bunch of cowards and hypocrites. You know, that's a surefire way to motivate people to risk their lives for you in a holy war, right? "I make this appeal to the sons of liberty of my native state for help to frustrate the wicked design of sinful men. I make it to hush the violence of mobs. I make it to cope with the unhallowed influence of wicked men in high places. I make it to resent the insult and injury made to an innocent, unoffending people by a lawless ruffian state. I make it to show our nation's escutcheon. I make it to show presidents, governors, and rulers prudence. I make it to fill honorable men with discretion. I make it to teach senators wisdom. I make it to learn judges justice. I make it to point clergymen to the path of virtue, and I make it to turn the hearts of this nation to the truth and realities of pure and undefiled religion, that they may escape the perditions of ungodly men. And Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is my great counselor." There it is. That's it, isn't it? Joe makes this appeal for his Mormon Inquisition, which all begins at the seat of anti-Mormonism, Missouri. I make this appeal to you, the Green Mountain Boys, to turn the hearts of this nation to the truth and realities of pure and undefiled religion. And God is my great counselor. Look, I called this a holy war, and people may find that as an overstatement or an alarmist reading of the passage, but that's exactly what this is. Mormonism is the pure and undefiled religion, and Joe's great designs are to turn the hearts of the nation to his pure, undefiled religion. The end of the world, as people of the 19th century knew it, was coming to an end, and Joseph Smith was the harbinger to bring about the desolation necessary to once and forever build the kingdom of God. He finishes. Wherefore, let the rich and the learned, the wise and the noble, the poor and the needy, the bond and the free, both black and white, take heed to their ways, and cleave to the knowledge of God, and execute justice and judgment upon the earth in righteousness, and prepare to meet the judge of the quick and the dead, for the hour of his coming is nigh. As a friend of equal rights to all men, and a messenger of the everlasting gospel of Jesus Christ, I have the honor to be your devoted servant. Signed, Joseph Smith. You see, desperation and ambition play in the same sphere for a guy like Joseph Smith. Everything we've discussed today reveals how desperate the Mormon settlement was. But rational answers and a cool-down period weren't in the cards because Joseph Smith was a parasite. He could only survive by feeding and consuming more. He thrived in chaos. He dreamt of the day all his previous scandals and misdeeds would be forgotten because he was the ruler of the entire world living under the iron fist of his Mormon theocracy. You can't go to prison and be hung for treason in Missouri if you're king of the nation, can you? People you owe money to suddenly stop knocking on your door when it's guarded by armed legionnaires. Who needs bankruptcy when the whole world bows to your military and religious supremacy? Who's going to throw you in jail when they have to fight through thousands of armed men willing to die for you before they can get handcuffs on you? Simply put, the only way that Joe saw out of the mess that he had created and this chaos on which he was thriving was by moving forward and never looking back. If he could keep expanding his power, building his empire, and quashing any dissenting voices, he would end the day victorious, wake up the next day, and do it all again. Desperation required Joseph Smith to never look back. Ambition required him to always look forward. But this isn't sustainable. The pace of chaos and scandal can't be maintained. You see, this is how most empires are built unless the figurehead is removed from power before the construction process is complete. And that's what happened to Joseph Smith. He was in the empire business and the wild frontier of America in his day. Well, let's say in that frontier America, business was good until it wasn't anymore. Desperation and ambition drove him, yet desperation and ambition damned him to an early grave. That's going to do it for our episode today. I have a little bit of listener mail to get to. Also, if you want to pledge to support the show, you can do so over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism and gain a whole bunch of access to extra content and extended not safe for work editions of every new episode. We don't have any new pledges to thank for this week, but hopefully that will be ameliorated next week and we come on and thank new patrons over on that episode. But why don't we go ahead and get to listener mail? First, I wanted to discuss an email by Molly. Now, Molly has written in quite a bit about the show, and we've answered a few questions from her, but she's a very thought-provoking person and sends in really good emails, so I'm going to read this most recent one. I thought it was quite interesting. She begins, "Hello, me again. Yeah, sorry, I know I promised I'd back off and leave you alone. I really hope you don't back off and leave me alone. I enjoy your emails." She says, "But this time my commentary is entirely about your most recent episode. It's just a small observation, so I thought it'd be okay." So, of course, this is referring back to last week's episode about Olive Fulmer and Milton Cook and the whole debacle between Carthage and Nauvoo. She says, "Basically, I just got to thinking about the case of Olive Amanda Smith Fulmer and the mess Milton Cook caused. More specifically, I was thinking about how I never heard about it. Not in Sunday school, not in seminary, and not in The Work and the Glory. Now, normally, that'd be no real cause for note. The Brighamite sect buries its history all the time. But any messes caused by the anti-Mormon factions near Nauvoo usually get brought up, especially if it can be used to paint Carthage as a wretched hive of scum and villainy. So one would think that this tale about a deadbeat dad running away and being protected by the people of Carthage so that he wouldn't have to take care of his kid would be something they'd talk about," which is quite a thought-provoking line of thinking, isn't it? So Molly asks, so I have to wonder, if Olive and Milton were never married, perhaps that's the reason why this story isn't used as propaganda. The conservatives in charge of crafting Mormon narratives might just consider Olive too sinful and dirty to be worth championing. Just a thought I had. I'd be curious to hear if you think so as well. So in response to that, I would say that is an entirely logical way of approaching this story. With Olive being not married, or no verifiable record of the two being married, and her being pregnant and giving birth to that kid, definitely brings up some interesting questions. I also didn't include this in the episode because, well, quite frankly, I didn't think that it was terribly relevant, but it's possibly relevant to discuss at this point in view of Molly's email. The people listed in the Olive as well as Milton, it listed them as not members of the church. So that's quite interesting as well, that it very clearly said that Olive, who is not a member of the church, is, filed out this affidavit, and subsequently an arrest warrant was filed for Milton Cook, who also is not a member of the church. And that was written contemporary at the time. But I think those are both fabrications because both of them died in Utah. Amanda Fulmer Smith, of course, being a polygamous wife of a very high-ranking Mormon official. I can't remember if it was Newell K. Whitney or Heber C. Kimball. But Milton Cook himself also died in Utah. There's very little documentation about him. So I think it's entirely reasonable that both of them were members at this time, but they were put forward in the popular press in the Nauvoo Neighbor as not being members because the Nauvoo police force wanted to make it seem like they weren't trying to police, just members of their church. They were going after this Mormon because he stepped out on his Mormon wife. And there may this all may have been the result of polygamy, of celestial marriage as well, which would further complicate matters quite a bit. Who knows what Milton Cook told his fellow Carthaginians when when the posse was coming into town to arrest him? Who knows what he was telling them? Who knows what he said to them about the posse that was going to arrest him? Maybe he told them what caused these people to defend him and, fight off the Mormon posse was true, that they were just coming to try and, get rid of him. Maybe he was about to leak something of the polygamy. Who knows? All I know is the guy died in Utah in the 1880s. That's really, really notable, isn't it? So the fact that this story is not talked about in Mormon propaganda circles, in the correlated Mormon narratives, it could be because, Olive was, had this child out of wedlock. She's too sinful and dirty, as you said, Molly, to be worth champion. That could be the case. Or it could also be the case that there's just some complicated history that isn't, readily available to us concerning polygamy at this time, and the way that Nauvoo policing practices were conducted is very seedy and quite disturbing and very mafia-like at this time, which is also an aspect worth minimizing in the believing and correlated work on the glory type of narrative. So yeah, it's an interesting question. And Molly, it's a really good email too, because I hadn't considered it from that perspective. I had just considered it from the perspective of the Nauvoo Neighbor said that neither of them are members of the church, which probably isn't true because both of them died in Utah. But yeah, awesome email. Thank you so much for that, Molly. Also got an email in from Mark, and Mark said, I just read through the article you co-authored, The Anti-Mormonic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis. Mark says, I really enjoyed it, and it struck me that this should get much more attention. Hey, I couldn't agree more with you, Mark. He says, in my opinion, this would be a superb topic for the Joe Rogan Show podcast, as he has an interest and experience with such things. I just wanted to encourage you to look into that, and of course, he provides a link to Joe Rogan. So in response to Mark and to, anyone who is interested in reading The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis, of course, this is the update on the Smith entheogen theory, the psychedelics in early Mormonism. That paper is now live, and I'm happy to report in the first week of it being published, we already have 500 reads on that article, which is really a spectacular showing for the very first week. I have contacted the Joe Rogan Show before as a person, as a human being, I don't necessarily agree with Joe Rogan on very many things, but he has a huge platform of people who, and some of those people do engage in psychedelics, and he does talk about Mormonism from time to time, and he talks a lot about DMT. So I have contacted Joe Rogan. I haven't gotten anything back from his producers or anything. So to Mark, or to anyone who thinks that this is a subject, that psychedelics and early Mormonism would be a subject that is good for the Joe Rogan podcast, I would love the opportunity of going on to and utilizing his platform to spread the word about this subject. And hey, if you want to hear a Joe Rogan podcast talking about the Smith entheogen theory, hey, shoot him an email, with a link to the paper. I've shot him an email. I'm going to send him another one. And, maybe if enough people send him some information and contact information that, hey, you should look into this. Hey, you should have this guy on your show. Maybe he'll respond to it. But the thing is like just getting one email from one random podcaster saying, hey, I'm doing this thing that we should talk about. Most podcasters don't respond to that, especially somebody like Joe Rogan, who has, millions of listeners. But with more people pinging their inbox and saying, hey, you should consider this. Hey, you should read this paper. Hey, you should have this person on your podcast to talk about their paper and their research. Maybe he'd respond to that, or it's more likely that he or his producers would respond to multiple emails instead of just one. So Mark, to anyone who wants a Joe Rogan podcast about psychedelics and early Mormonism, shoot him an email, joerogan.com/contact. And not just Joe Rogan, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with the guy on very many things. But if there are platforms out there that you think psychedelics and early Mormonism is a topic or a subject that would be worth discussing on their show, on their podcast, on their YouTube show, whatever, shoot them an email or get them in touch with me, or send their contact information to me. I'd love to breach into more platforms and audiences with this idea and with this research, and just spread the word, because I think it's a compelling and interesting theory. Add into that, I want to tell you, listeners, I'm going to be reading the paper, the updated paper, onto the podcast as it is slated. That's going to be the Christmas episode. I'm going to be out of town for Christmas, so what I'm going to do is front load a couple of episodes, or one or maybe two episodes. I think the paper is long enough to break it up into two episodes. I'm going to front load those episodes so that I'm able to travel and not have to worry about work for the holidays, and just be able to spend the time with family. So what that is going to be is my reading the paper with some commentary in addition to it on the actual podcast feed, and that's going to be coming around Christmas time. We have other plans. Me and the co-authors of the paper have some other plans with what we want to do with the paper to spread the word. But needless to say, the response from it so far has been absolutely fantastic. We are so excited. Me and all of the co-authors and I have been exchanging a lot of emails back and forth about the response, about what you listeners have been saying about it. And I have to just say thank you to everyone who has read it. If you're interested in reading it, you're going to find it once again linked up in the show notes for this week, as well as last week's episode. But to all of the people who have responded and who have gotten in touch and who have posted it in various subreddits and everything, thank you to all of you. And I love reading people who are interested in the subject, because it is just so fascinating to me. So with all of that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the episode for today. I want to really thank everyone. You all are listening to this. You all hit the download button. You all hit the play button. You all listened all the way to the end of the episode. And for that, I dearly thank you for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
It follows through.
This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.